Well, good morning, everyone, and again, welcome all of you to our worship today, visitors and new members. Today, we are continuing with our look at how God communicated with His people. We've been looking at prophets and leaders, people that were chosen by God to reveal His Word and His message to His people. And today, I'd like to continue with our study, looking at some of the judges and the period of the judges. Last time we talked about Moses and Miriam. They were the dominant prophets during the time of the Exodus. And the period that we're going to look at today picks up from the time of the death of Joshua, who followed Moses as leader of the people, from the death of Joshua down through the death of Samson and the beginning of the work of Samuel and Eli. The period of time that we're looking at, the time of the judges, lasted for a period of about 300 to 350 years. We're not exactly sure of the exact dates, but it's about 3.5 centuries, 3 to 3.5 centuries. And it covers a time when the people were living in the land. They had been given laws, guidelines, counsel about how to live as a society and how to live morally. They had the sanctuary set up at Shiloh, where they were to meet and worship several times a year. They could inquire there of the high priest about God's directions. But there was no central government. And aside from these periodic feasts, the 3 times a year where all of the men were expected to gather together, the people and the tribes did what they wanted. The tribes were led by the local elders, the local families. There was no central government. And even within the tribes, it pretty much broke down to the local level. Local cities, towns, villages did as they pleased. And we read in Judges in several different places a very famous passage. Each man did what was right in his own eyes. Now, you would think that given the miraculous delivery of the land of Canaan to these people, how they saw God lead them into this place, the fall of Jericho, the crossing of the Jordan, the victories that God gave them over their enemies in establishing them in the land, the fact that they had the law repeated to them on several occasions by Moses and later by Joshua. The people gathered together and reviewed the law before Joshua retired. You would think that with all of these steps that were taken and all of the things that were done, with all of the framework that was created to guide them and to provide what they needed to have a safe, happy, and prosperous society, that all would be well. But what happened? Within a generation, the people turned away from God. After the death of Joshua and the death of the generation that came into the land, the people quickly fell into the practices of their neighbors. They did not drive out the Canaanites, the Amorites, the Jebusites, the people that were living around them, like they were directed to do and they were supposed to do. They allowed these people to remain in the land, even during Joshua's time. And Joshua warned them that that would cause them trouble. And we read in Judges that because the people did not drive out their enemies came to corrupt them and to control them and to dominate them. And that is a warning to us today. We have enemies in our lives. Now, I don't mean people at work or your neighbors, but we all have sin in our lives. We all have problems, things that challenge us, and things which we need to overcome. And we need to face these challenges. We need to attack these problems in our lives. We need to wrestle and overcome these sins that God reveals to us. The Bible tells us that all of the problems that we face, all the challenges that we have, we can overcome with God's help. God does not put any challenges before us. He does not give us any tests beyond what we are able to endure, or what we cannot overcome with God's help. But too often we're like the Israelites. We're comfortable with sin in our lives. Well, this one, it's not so serious. It's not so bad. I can live with this problem. It may cause me some discomfort from time to time, but that's okay. It's all right. I can live with it, and I can keep it under control. But if you allow a problem to remain, if you do not treat a problem, if you don't deal with a problem, does the problem go away? No. Does it get smaller? No. No. Any problem which goes untreated, any condition which is ignored, any situation which is not addressed, it only becomes more deeply enrooted, and it only gets stronger and bigger. And we need to face and address and attack and root out the sins and challenges that God places before us. God tests us. He allows us to be tested, to see what we are truly made of. The Bible talks about gold refined in the fire 7 times. We're going to have to go through some difficult and challenging situations in our lives to demonstrate what we are truly made of. When we are challenged, how will we respond? Will we be true to God, or will we fall away and follow the easy course? And in the case of these Israelites, when they were tested, when they were tried, they tended to follow the easy course. It was too much work to get rid of their remaining neighbors, so they allowed them to live in peace. And in the years that followed, these various enemies grew in strength and in confidence. They had seen the Israelites overcome kingdoms and cities and tribes, but when they were allowed to remain in the land, they gained confidence. Well, we survived. We were better than these other people who got crushed and destroyed. Maybe their God is not going to punish us like those people, and we can overcome. And so their enemies gained strength, and as the Israelites adopted the customs and the worship of the gods around them and turned away from God, God allowed them to fall under the control and under the power and under the thumb of these neighboring kingdoms and people. And what happens when people get miserable? They complain, right? They complain. When life is going fine, when there's nothing rocking the boat, people are happy to keep going, right? Oh, I don't need to change anything. Life is comfortable. Why change? Everything is okay. There's no reason to change. I'm comfortable. It's like what we read in Revelation, right? The message to the Laodicean church. Oh, you think you're okay. You know, you're comfortable. You have everything you feel that you need. So you think life is okay because you're comfortable. Wake up and realize your true situation. And these Israelites, when they begin to suffer, when they were oppressed, then they complained. And then they turned to God. Oh, God, save us. We need deliverance from our enemies, or from the enemy, from these raiders. And so, God, in His mercy, after they did suffer for a while, He would raise up a judge, a man or woman, to lead them against their oppressors, to rescue them. And during this time, we know of at least 13 different people who were called to serve as judges. Some of them we know a lot about. Some we know very little. It just says, you know, this person was called and they rescued the people. That's all we know. We don't really know about all of the judges. But we do know that in each case there was a pattern. As we read in the Scripture, when a judge was called by God, when the Spirit moved upon this man or woman, and they brought their message to the people, and the people responded, they were used to deliver the people. And a period of prosperity and peace would follow. And during the life of that judge, God allowed the people to remain at peace. And what happened? The judge would die and people went back to their old ways. Very quickly, they went back to their old customs and old habits and old patterns. And we see the same pattern of behavior again and again and again. And you know, that's what it is like in our own lives often. You know, we have trouble in our lives and we ask God, oh God, you know, save me. I need help. And God in His mercy rescues us from that trouble. And what happens? For a while, we may continue, and then we fall back into bad habits, or we allow something else to distract us. We're no different than the Israelites. It's human nature. By nature, we fall back into sin, or we don't keep going. You know, we take one step, and we're, okay, I made some progress. This is good enough. This is far enough. God expects us to grow on a daily basis. God expects us to search and to find. And as we find and discover the truth, we have to step up. We have to advance. We need to progress in our relationship with God. We can't become stunted. We can't stagnate. We can't just sit at one level. We are expected to continually advance, continually improve ourselves, day by day. This morning I would like to very briefly look at one or two of these judges and talk a little bit about them. The first of these judges is called Deborah, and we read about her in chapter 4 and 5 of the book of Judges. Deborah is listed as a prophetess and judge. She was someone who God revealed messages, and she shared these messages with the people. The people came to her for judgment, to settle disputes. And the people were being oppressed, and so they called out to God, and God revealed the answer through Deborah. And so she called one of the leaders of the tribes and called him to raise an army to fight against these enemies, and promised that God would give him victory if he would act in faith to raise an army and lead this army against the enemies. And this man, Balak, he was willing to lead, but he was a little lacking in faith and confidence. And so he said, I will go if you will go with me. And so Deborah agreed. She told Balak, all right, I will go with you. I will go with the army. But because I go with you, women will receive the credit for the victory. Of course, at that time, the men were usually the leaders of the army. Men fought the battles, and men received the praise. But in this particular case, the final hero was not Balak, but it was Deborah and another woman, Jael, who actually killed the enemy commander after the battle was over, and he fled and found shelter with her, and she killed him while he was sleeping. Through the work of Deborah, through the inspiration that God provided her, the armies of Israel received a victory, and they had 40 years of peace. And there's a very long song, or songs of Deborah, that we find in chapter 5, which describes how God rescued the people, and how He was their strength, and how He was their source of victory and courage. Another very famous judge we read about actually in the next few chapters of Judges, Gideon. I'm sure all of you have heard of Gideon, right? And again, Gideon was not a very famous person. He was the youngest son of a big family, a minor tribe. A minor family, not from a minor tribe. He was from the tribe of Ephraim, one of the biggest tribes, but his house was not an important one. and he had many older brothers. And yet, he was the one that God appeared to. This young man, youngest son, a minor family. And his family wasn't even completely God-fearing. His father had been worshiping idols, had set up an altar. And yet, when the angel appeared to Gideon, Gideon was receptive. And he accepted the call to serve, even though he was afraid. Even though he felt inadequate, he responded and acted. And that's a very important point we need to remember. It is not our power that results in victory. It is not by our ability that God's work is going to be carried out. We are simply partners with God. God will use us, and He will bless us, and He will expand what we do. But it is through partnership with Him. As the Bible says, not by my might or power, but by Thy Spirit. We have to be willing to work with God. If we are willing to take that step in faith, using what little that we have, God can do great things. Jesus talked about that when He talked about faith, right? He said, if you have the faith as small as a mustard seed, right? Even a little bit of faith, and you act on that small amount, you can move mountains. God will multiply and expand what you have if you will put it into His hands. If you will work in God's service, He will use you much further and more than you can ever imagine. And as we look at the story of Gideon, that's what we see. This young man, he was not a trained officer, and yet he responded when God called. And though he had his fears and doubts, and he asked God for signs, sometimes multiple signs, really? Really? God was patient with him. And God worked with him step by step, gradually, starting off with a small task and building up to the point where he led the army to victory against the enemies of Israel and rescued them and served as judge for many years. God will do the same thing with us and with you. He will start with something small. The Bible says, if you are faithful with the little things, God will make you stronger so that you can handle the bigger responsibilities. When Jesus told the story of the parable, that's what we see, right? The person who used a small amount and multiplied it, they were given more. And the person who had something but didn't use it, what happened? It was taken away, right? If you put your talents to use in God's service, He will multiply and expand what you have and the influence of what you do. But if you don't use your talents, if you refuse to work, even that skill that you have will diminish and will be taken away. If you're going to improve something, you have to use it. Whether it's exercise for muscles, people who work out. If you don't do anything, what happens to your muscles? Do they get stronger? Do they stay the same? No. If you do nothing, your muscles disappear, right? They naturally just go away. You have to do at least some exercise to maintain your current level of fitness. And if you want to improve, you've got to use your muscles a lot, 4 or 5 times a week, to improve on your strength. And as Christians, it's the same way. If we don't use the knowledge and the faith that we have, it'll disappear. We have to use what we have every day. We have to take the blessings that God has given and put them to work and put them to use. And if we will do that, God will expand our efforts and the results of our efforts beyond what we can even begin to imagine. Jesus talked about the kernel of wheat, right? You drop a seed in the ground and it multiplies. It produces a harvest greater than before. Noah's a farmer. And to get crops, you have to plant seed. But from one seed, you can gain many fruit. Many things can be produced from one seed. And as Christians, we have to remember and apply that principle in our daily life. One kind word, one helpful deed can multiply in its effects on other people. It can cascade across society and time. There's a story of a missionary who went to India. He spent his whole life working in India, and at the end of his life, he only converted one man. A servant who had been with him for many years. That was the only convert he had. And yet, that servant went on and converted many people. It would be easy to look at the missionary's work and say, oh, your life was wasted. You spent 30 or 40 years in a country and only one convert. I can think of many Adventist conferences that would say, oh, well, if you're a pastor, you've only had one convert, we're going to have to replace you. You're not doing your job. But over time, the long-term benefits of that one man's mission, of his testimony, of his work, it yielded fruit thousands of times beyond what anyone could imagine, or he even imagined during his lifetime. In closing today, I'd like you to think about that point. What are you doing with your talent? Are you using what God has given you? One action, one word, can multiply beyond what you can imagine, both for good or for evil. And my challenge to each one of us is to be a positive servant, to use the opportunities, the time, the talents that we have, put them into God's hands. Allow yourself to be an instrument. If you do that, you will be a blessing to yourself, to your family, to your community. Thank you.